It's so frustrating because I think there is maybe something here. I think maybe we shouldn't use as much red dye as we do.
But can we use good science to prove
Yes,
that?
please. Literally, don't tell me that there are 15 million pounds of red dye 40 and then cite an article about estrogen from red 3.
Seriously. 15 million pounds.
Where? When?
How? Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Beauty by the Beaker. I'm Sadie.
She's real Sadie this time.
I'm real Sadie. I'm back.
A sentient one. And I'm Natalie, the same one.
Yes. And this is the podcast where science gets a hot new makeover. Like Nat said, I'm back this week. I missed you all last week, but I was here in body and spirit, as you saw.
And Owen didn't pee on you,
Oh,
which is great.
good.
I actually was worried. That was the second place I looked.
Marked safe from Owen.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank God. Yeah, I'm back. I'm better than ever, and I'm ready to get into today's episode.
Well, I am so glad that you are because today's episode is going to be quite a doozy.
Ooh, let's get into it.
Earlier in the month, we talked about gold. Then we talked about green. And then we promised more fun color episodes for you. But unfortunately, because of Sadie's absence, it's delayed a bit. But today is the day. And we're talking about a color that's hot.
We're Roy G. Biven over here. We're going to cover every color.
This color is so hot. Maybe even red hot.
Ooh.
Is it red 40? Maybe. It might be red 3.
Just one of the reds.
It might be. We seem to have lost track somewhere along the way.
There are a lot. Up to 40, theoretically.
Theoretically, yes. But today we are talking about color additives. And is poverty the reason that you're on Adderall? I ask myself because I'm the one on Adderall. And the one without a job.
In poverty, on Adderall, ready to talk about red 40.
Woo! The American dream, baby.
Yeah. Oh my God. You've made it. Gas is $4 a gallon. Like, we're really there.
I am a conservative nightmare right now.
Yeah. No, actually.
And I'm not going to make it any better because...
She's a bisexual.
So that goes without saying.
Yeah, that was clear.
Today we have a lot to talk about. And colorants are a very interesting, at least interesting to me, topic because they are all FDA regulated. So we have talked about the FDA from time to time on this podcast, and we are going to have to talk about them a lot today too. FDA, if you do not know, stands for Food and Drug Administration.
And this is a U.S. based
Yes.
regulatory body.
It is. Typically, when we're talking about them, it's because we're talking about a drug that's topically applied that's usually kind of disguised itself as a cosmetic. So something like a tinted SPF is a perfect example of that. Makeup that has crossed over into technically being a drug. But we in the US have kind of blurred the lines. So the FDA kind of blurs the lines between what they regulate as well. Today's episode is different though, because even though we are going to be talking about food on today's episode, we're not talking about topically applied drugs necessarily. We still have to talk about the FDA because they regulate color additives in all cosmetics, not just topically applied drugs. So,
Can you explain the difference between FDA regulation for regular cosmetics versus, because they're still regulated, but not necessarily by the FDA. I just don't want people to get nervous that regular cosmetics aren't regulated.
Yes. So the FDA does have some oversight into cosmetics. It's not just completely without any oversight.
It's not a free for all.
Yes, but because cosmetics are meant to beautify one's appearance, that's, I think, the actual wording in the FDA's website, and not to add any sort of actual benefit, health benefit or otherwise to a human person.
Yeah, it like changes the structure or function of the body. I think that's the wording
Yeah.
for like a drug versus a cosmetic is to beautify.
Yes, and so they still oversee things, like they are still the body that makes sure that cosmetics are being safely manufactured and that the labels that are being put on them are true and accurate, but they're not necessarily testing them, and there aren't specific tests that need to be done in order to go onto the market. Unlike a drug or a food item, you could just start selling a cosmetic out of your kitchen. And you could do that technically without being in trouble until you had an issue. And that's when the FDA steps in. Unlike a drug or food item, which as soon as you started selling, they'd be like, whoa, you can't be doing that.
Yeah, you can DIY a lotion and sell it, but you cannot DIY a sunscreen.
Right.
Or an antiperspirant. Like,
Right.
there are rules for what you're allowed to sell.
Yeah. And that's because those types of ingredients chemically change your skin function in some way.
Yeah.
But color additives, even though they are kind of a big deal in cosmetics, a lot of the purpose of them.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the cosmetic industry is color cosmetics, and all color additives are fully FDA governed. So I added this little thing from the FDA's website because being in a cosmetic formulation perspective of FDA colorants, it is kind of interesting the way that they are. We're going to get a lot more into the history of why the FDA regulates colorants, but the current wording of them, it's kind of interesting as well. I don't know.
Is it a little ambiguous?
It's as many things are, yes.
Yeah, a troll riddle, if you will.
Yeah, so from their website, it says, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FD&C Act, provides that a substance that is capable of imparting color is a color additive and is subject to pre-market approval requirements unless the substance is used in a product solely for a purpose other than coloring and is clearly unimportant to the marketability of the product. Okay, so what this means from a cosmetic formulation standpoint is that there are a list of approved colorants. Anything that you're going to be used in foods, drugs, cosmetics, or medical devices, any colorant has to be approved by the FDA. Then it's approved for uses in certain things at certain levels.
Okay.
And so what that paragraph is saying is that you can't put something into a product that changes the color of the product unless that just so happens to happen. If that's the goal, is changing the color, then that is considered FDA regulated. So it gets a little bit confusing when we get into things like fruit extracts and stuff.
Yeah.
Because it does also say that you can use a substance that changes the color as long as the purpose is for something other than coloring and that the color of the product has nothing to do with the marketing.
That makes sense.
So, yeah.
That's like, I feel like an example of that would be like copper peptides. Those are an ingredient they're blue.
Yes.
And you can add them to a product and it'll change the product usually to like a really pretty blue color.
Right.
But the function is not to color it. It's like the copper peptides have a different function.
Right.
But I wonder if people can kind of get around that if they market like it's a hydrating product. And like you think that hydration equals blue. And so they can kind of.
Yeah. But they do have to be very careful not to include any marketing about the color because it's not an approved colorant and the color is being imparted by a non-approved colorant source.
That makes
sense. So
sense.
they can't say like blue serum.
Yeah.
Because that would be crossing over into a line of unapproved colorant.
They have to
because you're marketing the blue.
They have to let the customer make that connection themselves.
Yes.
That makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to keep going with this because this is just some interesting...
No, this is actually so fascinating.
interesting pre-info on how the FDA sees colors today.
Yeah.
And then we'll rewind.
Okay.
So because of inherent limitations of science, the FDA can never be absolutely certain of the absence of any risk from the use of any substance. Therefore, the FDA must determine, based on the best science available, if there is a reasonable certainty of no harm to consumers when a color additive is used as proposed. The FDA does not approve the use of a color additive that is found to induce cancer in people or animals.
That's good.
That is good. We'll talk more about that. Basically, they're kind of giving their own little disclaimer here, like, we have some colorants that are approved and, we can't ever be completely sure that they're safe.
Yeah.
But we're not going to give you things that we know know are unsafe. If a color additive is approved, the FDA issues regulations that may include the types of foods in which it can be used, the maximum amounts to be used, and how it should be labeled for marketing to product manufacturers, and whether it requires batch certification. The level used in foods is usually limited to the amount necessary to achieve the desired effect. If new evidence suggests that a product already in use may be unsafe, or if consumption levels have changed enough to require another look, federal authorities may prohibit the use or conduct further studies to determine if the use can still be considered safe.
Okay, yeah.
Great.
Basically, the FDA regulates it, and they are, in theory, looking out for you.
In theory, yes. So that's our little precursor to this episode.
Okay.
So now I think to really understand and answer the question, should we be avoiding all products with red 40 in them? To understand why everyone is so specifically concerned with red tolerance, I think we need to have a little bit of background in dyes in general.
Yeah.
So what is a dye? I had a scientific definition in here and I deleted it because I didn't want to bore anyone. But basically, there are certain molecules that are able to bind to things, like they're just kind of sticky molecules. So they have one end that binds, and then when they are exposed to energy, such as light or heat, they vibrate at a frequency that then our eyes perceive as a color. So they give off a wavelength. They absorb light and they reflect a wavelength, and we perceive a color.
Yep.
So a dye is a molecule that will vibrate at this wavelength when it is exposed to light, and that will stick to whatever medium we're trying to get it to stick to. Humans have been using dyes for all sorts of things other than just food and cosmetics. For centuries, we have been using them for things all the way from religious purposes to dyeing clothing and other textiles, making paints for art, pottery, homes, storytelling, and just a lot of other things.
Yeah.
Basically, every industry involves dyes to some extent.
We like our colors as humans.
We do.
Yeah, they're fun.
And we've been liking them for a very, very long time. Like I said, for centuries, we've been doing this.
Listen, as far back as I go, and certainly probably farther.
Actually, the use of pigments and dyes, it's kind of considered to be one of the first signs of human intellectual advancement for being able to kind of distill specific resources from their environment.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's like one of the first, this is when humans became really good at thinking about things.
When we went from caveman to...
Well, yeah, no, cavemen were doing it.
Oh.
Painting on their walls.
Okay, when we went from Neanderthals to cavemen.
Yeah, it was one of the very first things in history that we were doing.
It was we discovered fire and then we discovered dye.
Paint. Yeah, pretty much.
Shout
yeah,
out.
Which makes sense. All of us have probably been on a hike and wanted to carve something into a rock, which don't do that.
I never have, and I never will.
I would never.
But I've wanted to.
I was just in southern Utah, and I know that people are doing it.
Oh, yeah, they still are. And a lot of those couples are probably broken up now. I will say.
Was it worth it?
Was it really?
So the things that early humans were using as dyes were extracted from nature. A lot of the dyes came from vegetables and animals. But there's actually a big overlap between spices and natural colorants. Things like turmeric, paprika, saffron, and annatto. We don't have time. We do not have time to cover the spice trade on this podcast today.
No, we could make a whole new podcast about the spice trade.
But as is kind of common, many of our current beauty standards and rituals are rooted in classism.
I also love how many S's you use to spell that word.
I needed several.
Yeah, there are a lot involved.
S-class.
Yes, S-tier.
Exactly. So color is certainly no exception to this, and color has been used from the very beginning of human time as a way to distinguish and divide people. And in many ways, it still is, just in different ways than it used to be. And in the same ways, honestly.
Honestly, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Exactly, yeah. So before colonization happened, people were making dyes out of the resources that they had locally available. But after explorers went out and brought a bunch of new colors to wealthy Europeans, the demands for items in these colors went up really drastically. By the late 1800s, global trade was already causing concerns when it came to resources.
Yeah.
So we're already worried about deforestation by this point.
Oh, God.
And yeah. Many of the plants that were being used to make desirable spices and dyes were being used up at just unsustainable rates.
And also, it probably was extremely difficult to extract those things.
Yeah.
It just takes so many resources to extract the level of dye that was demanded.
Right. So then introducing our first synthetic pigment.
Yay. Yeah, it had to happen.
I actually just threw this in here because our first synthetic pigment was not in this timeline whatsoever. It was actually in 3250 BC.
Oh. The Europeans they're late to everything.
They are.
That doesn't surprise me.
We're going to cover a little bit more of European tradition here because the color that is credited as being the actual first synthetic pigment is Egyptian blue.
I bet that's a gorgeous color.
It actually is.
Actually, I bet it is.
It actually is. And yes, I threw this in here because I did want to talk about this, but pigments and dyes are technically not the same thing. So this is the first pigment. So we're jumping back to that. Then we'll get into dyes again.
Just on this journey, we're taking a left turn.
But I wanted to talk about this one because we actually did talk about it on our first episode a little bit when we talked about like the ancient Egyptian beauty.
Yeah.
Ancient Egyptians are credited for making the first synthetic pigment. And interestingly enough, they did not keep any record of how they made it.
It's a trade secret.
It's a trade secret.
It's like the KFC spices.
Exactly. But we do have Roman record of it.
Oh, okay. Airing their dirty laundry, I
Literally.
guess.
And with more advanced scientific analytical tools, scientists have basically been able to dupe the pigment recipe. So we've kind of reverse engineered it. It's kind of cool because they are able to see traces of the pigment on things that like no longer visually appear to be blue. So even though all the dye has like worn off, not dye, pigment. So yeah.
That's great.
Well, unlike dyes, pigments are not soluble.
Which means like dissolve.
Yes. They just sit on top of surfaces. So when like Egyptians were using it, they would grind up these pigments, which they did synthetically produce. But then the size of the grounds kind of determined what color it reflected. I mean, you can kind of think of it with like diamonds versus like sand or something. You know, a big piece of diamond is going to reflect a really like clear color. And then the more you grind it up, the more opaque it's going to get.
Yep.
So this was kind of similar. Bigger pigment pieces would be like a deep blue. And then if you ground it up, you'd get like a really light, powdery baby blue. It's really cool.
Did it also have to do with how thick they applied it as well? Yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
Is that also why they have disappeared? Because they just sat on top of surfaces?
Yeah, just kind of on top so it eventually can kind of chip off or wear off.
That makes sense.
So back to dyes and back to our timeline. So back in the 1800s, before electricity was used to power cities, coal was our primary source of, power, light, running trains. Yeah, so they were using coal, and after burning coal, it left behind this dark, sticky residue. And coal was being used super extensively, so there was a lot of this dark residue being left behind. And originally, we were just dumping it into the water because, out of sight, out of mind.
Literally, that is so 1800s.
Literally, yeah. Like, I hate this stuff.
Let's put it in the water where we swim and take baths.
Yeah. Let's just drink it later when we don't have to think about it.
It's flavor.
Yeah. But then, they're like, maybe we could try to figure out what to do with this.
Well, they started running out of coal, I'm sure. And they were like, is there a way?
Well, more it was like, there has to be something to do with all this.
Did they run out of water to throw it in?
Probably more. It was probably more that. But yeah, they were using a lot of coal, and the stuff, which it's called coal tar, was being produced. And so scientists were trying to, it was a byproduct. And they're like, you could save a lot of money by not dumping this in the ocean and instead figuring out something beneficial. So a lot of research was going into what can we do with this?
Yeah.
Coal tar. And eventually they figured out that you could extract something from it called aniline, which is a volatile organic compound. It's an aromatic compound and it's a precursor to a bunch of stuff. So it's lightly basic and it changed the game for a lot of synthetic manufacturing.
Ooh.
The first synthetic dye was actually made on accident.
Ooh.
By an 18-year-old British chemist. And he was trying to use coal tar to make a synthetic version of a malaria drug. As he was like washing out his beaker at the end of a failed attempt, it turned this like vibrant purple color.
Wait, that's so fun.
Yeah. He used it then to I think dye silk, which it worked. And it was the first synthetic dye. And it was called mauvine or mauve or aniline purple. Those are kind of all the names that they've been called. But this like mauve color became very popular throughout all of Europe. It was being used to dye like clothing because this purple dye was so popular. Within a couple of years, scientists made coal tar dyes to fill in the rest of the rainbow. So it was something that accidentally sparked a whole industry of synthetic dye production.
By some random 18-year-old.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And then, it was so successful that they were like, okay, we need to do all these.
Game. And also we can recycle what we've been feeding to the fishes. So
Yeah.
That's really awesome too.
Yeah, it's great. Feed 2 birds with 1 scone.
Exactly. Feed 2 birds with 1 coal tar.
I couldn't do more animal cruelty references with a different...
No, it's already too many. We're going to feed a fed horse.
Exactly. So shortly after these coal tar dyes were being used in textiles, they made their way into foods. And can you...
They were already in our water, so...
True. Not even the dyes, just the coal tar.
In general, so...
Not even extracted into anything else.
No.
Just pure... unadulterated coal tar.
Hell yeah.
Just the way we like it.
Yeah.
Can you guess what the first dyed food was?
I can because I'm reading your notes. It did save, right? Very good.
Yeah, otherwise I would have just ended it all.
Otherwise, I would have gone home and we would have canceled the podcast. You would have gone back to corporate America. Maybe a job in finance.
We were right on our first colored synthetic food. Did we? I don't think we even gave it away.
No, we didn't. Cliffhanger of the century.
Cliffhanger alert.
Yeah.
So what was it? We gave you some time to think.
Yeah. You had about 15 minutes to ruminate that one.
Well, the hint is that it made a very strong comeback last year.
Is it found in many foods?
It's not anymore.
Well, its namesake.
Yeah, that's the fun thing about colors is I don't really plan on talking about this in the episode. So maybe I should just throw it in here really quick. Since we're already cliffhanging.
Literally.
Let's keep it cliffhanging.
We'll give you more time to think.
We mentioned that colors have numbers. That has to do with like discovery and when they started using them. So like red 40 was in response to a different red being no longer used. But it was like the 40. It really was like the 40th red. So, but... they often also have like a common name and like a trade name almost as well.
Interesting. Like an inky versus trade name situation, kind of?
Yeah, sort of. So like a good example maybe that I'm thinking of, because I still admittedly really like this color, would be like millennial pink.
So cute.
That's not actually a color.
Yeah.
But there were colors that had... names like sunset yellow that was the trade name of that specific color, and it's like almost a patented yellow ingredient. Because like I mentioned, the thing that's kind of hard to realize with dyes, because it's like, why do we need 40 different reds?
Yeah.
But the way that the molecules work is that they vibrate at a frequency that we see as red. And so depending on, red is a spectrum. All colors are in a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so depending on exactly how that molecule vibrates, you'll get a slightly different shade as well. So
and like different hues of the same shade. Yeah.
Yes. So people will continue to develop new dyes because new colors can kind of be invented almost.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. Like just because in nature that's a color, or like we see it in a transitional phase in nature, like a flower or something, like certain shades, doesn't necessarily mean we've always been able to produce that color.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, you've waited long enough.
You've waited long enough.
Leave it in the comments.
So the first synthetic food dye was called butter yellow.
Love it.
And it was actually used in butter.
Oh, okay.
It's actually the exact, I don't want to say exact. If I do say it's the exact same color, then based on this discussion,
that would imply
that it's the same molecule. Butter yellow has been removed from use because it was a coal tar dye. We'll talk about it.
It's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing. It's a whole
episode.
So in the 1900s, coal tar dyes were being used in a bunch of different foods, and manufacturers liked these because you could use dyes in foods at very, very small amounts, and it would keep the food looking a very vibrant color, and it was really easy to control. The colors of these synthetic coal tar dyes were really consistent, and there was a certain color fastness. So they were consistent through a long time. That was really important for food manufacturers because their customers, they want to be able to expect the same thing every single time.
Yeah.
In the 1900s, these coal tar dyes were being used mainly to make foods look more appetizing, but also to hide any imperfections in the food. Then, after a bunch of these started being used, they decided to start investigating what these colorants actually were that companies are using,
That's a good idea.
So, yeah, they were invented and they're like, yeah, we can use these things.
Wait, it makes this super pink.
Yeah.
This is awesome. Let's add.
We love it.
Yeah, no, this is great.
It's fun.
And we're already drinking it in our water.
Exactly. Micro and macro impacts,
Exactly.
So, yeah, after they had already started being used pretty widely throughout foods, investigations started into the colorants and showed that many of the starting materials for these colorants were actually super toxic. A lot of them came from kind of our holy trinity of human poisons: arsenic, lead, and mercury.
That's the big three right there.
Yeah. So, in 1906, we've talked about her before, but the Pure Food and Drugs Act was signed. We've talked about the impacts of this in previous episodes, but basically this act was not necessarily intended to remove all the harmful ingredients from cosmetics and food, but rather it was intended to no longer allow companies to be deceptive in how they labeled products.
That's actually so crazy that it took until 1906 for them to be like, you guys should probably stop lying to your customers.
Yeah. Let's maybe make it a law that you can't lie.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if we're talking about vitamins, we got to see some proof.
Seriously. Quit the fibbing. Extremely recent. Way too recent for my taste.
Right. But it was also in 1906 that they really cracked down on food dyes, and they did limit the number of food dyes that were being used from around 80 to 7.
Oh, wow.
Because like I said, a lot of them were made out of things that they're like, yeah, no mercury in the food dyes.
No,
it's the 1900s.
Yeah, this was so last century.
Yeah, we're done. We got to be done. Then over the next 30 or so years, government oversight for color additives continued to change, but the list of approved colorants actually grew. By 1931, there were 15 colors approved for use in food, 6 of which are still approved for use today. That was in 1931. The 6 that are still approved for use today being relative because some of these are actively changing, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
But the 6 that were approved in 1931 that still can be found on American shelves today, as we are filming this episode,
yes,
are, this kind of also is a good example of the U.S. name, so the pre-approved name, and then the trade name, if you will. So FD&C Blue number 1, which is also called Brilliant Blue. FD&C Blue number 2, which is Indigotine. FD&C Green number 3, Fast Green, FCF. FD&C Red number 3, Erythrosine. FD&C yellow number 5, tartrazine, and FD&C yellow number 6, sunset yellow. So FD&C stands for food, drug, and cosmetic. So if a color is FD&C approved, it means you can use it in foods, drugs, and cosmetics. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can just free for all use as much as you want in whatever you want. There are still rules about that. But yeah, all of these ones are FD&C colorants, but there are also D&C colorants and external D&C colorants.
Those ones are just not approved for food.
Yes. Yeah. So those are two different types of classifications. So you can see external D&C or D&C.
Is external, what's the difference between external and regular?
If it's internalized by you. So there are colorants that are approved for use in like ingested medications, but not food.
Oh, okay.
So
or like
external.
Would like a toothpaste be considered like an internal?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yep.
I forgot that drugs is not just cosmetic OTC products.
I know. There's like other things like
real drugs.
Yeah. Like medicines and stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that is kind of the interesting thing is that there are a lot of artificial colorants used in medication.
Yeah, my
A lot.
ibuprofen is red.
Yeah. Almost every medication is a bright color. Why?
Yeah.
I don't know.
To make it more fun.
Yeah.
It's like, sorry you have to take this cough medicine, but it is pink. So.
Yeah. So with these colors also, there's like the FD&C color plus number situation. But then there's also like the trade name, if you will, like brilliant blue. So the way that the FDA regulates these colors is when the company that's making the colorant makes it, they make a batch of brilliant blue and then they send it into approval to the FDA, and the FDA, after they've made all of their approvals, gives it their name, FD&C Blue 1. The FDA, like we mentioned, is an American government body. So these names aren't what's going to be on labels in other countries.
Yeah.
So sometimes you'll see common name, trade name, or like a other naming system for the way that they regulate in like the EU or somewhere else. So throwing that in there really quickly.
And also leave it to the FDA to just take it and make it more boring.
Seriously.
They have such cute names.
I know.
They're like, no.
Yeah.
FD&C red number 7.
Yeah, we're not putting sunset yellow on your ingredient list.
No.
Sorry.
That's too fun.
Well, the FDA definitely doesn't have any issue with fun when it comes to color. Which might be an interesting segue to what happened with Orange 1.
Have you guys heard the stories?
Have you heard the stories of Orange 1?
The rumors, the nastiness?
Something happened on Halloween in 1950. And when I first heard this, I was like, how the hell did they know it happened on Halloween?
Yeah, true.
But they do.
There's evidence.
Yeah, it definitely happened on Halloween because a company called Clover Brand made a candy that they called Spooky Lozenges. What made them so spooky, might you ask?
They're lozenges?
Well, no, it's that they contained approximately 1 to 2% of synthetic dye orange number 1.
Per lozenge?
Yeah.
That's a lot of color.
Yeah.
Woof.
Yeah, so kids were eating this candy and pretty quickly they were experiencing nausea, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. So they launched an investigation into color additives in general. And then in 1960, the FDA was given jurisdiction over all color additives.
Like, okay, you've done too much.
Yeah, so after this incident happened in 1950, they basically said, we need to put some sort of limit on how much coal tar we can be putting into the candy that we're going to be giving our children.
That's valid.
Yeah.
I'm glad someone said it.
Yeah. They said, man, we can't be letting people run wild with this coal tar.
Yeah, no, guys. We used to drink it. It's taken us 150 years to tighten up regulations, but we're here now.
We are here. So at this time, they enacted what is called the Delaney Clause, which basically allows the FDA to pull authorization for the use of any colorants if they're shown to cause cancer in humans or animals. So kind of an interesting, like, I don't know. I thought it would go without saying.
Yeah, I was just going to say they needed a clause for that.
I know. I was like, okay, sure. I'm not going to be opposed to it.
Like, okay. Yeah, no, I agree, actually.
Yeah.
Speak your truth, FDA.
But honestly, maybe there's reason for that. Anyway,
yeah.
we'll get there. So at this point, all colorants that were being used were then listed as, so this is where it gets kind of confusing with the FDA. Because obviously Orange 1 was out there. It was approved for use. People were using it. At this point, there was like 15 dyes that they were allowed to use.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were like, we shouldn't be using this at 1 to 2% per lozenge. It's making our kids sick.
Yeah, now we found.
Yeah, we've decided that.
Through extensive research.
So then at that point, they have to make a decision. What do we do about all the colors that are currently being put into foods?
Mm-hmm.
Basically everything with the FDA and food regulation in general. When it comes to the US and food laws, they're kind of strange. So it's a little bit hard to get super clear information about what's going on. But from what I could tell, all of the colorants were then listed as being approved provisionally. So they were provisionally listed, which basically just means that they've been being used and there's not evidence to show that they're dangerous yet. But we also haven't proved that they're safe. They're just still there. Like, we're not going to pull them without reason, but we haven't tested them fully enough to prove that they're safe. So all of these colors are listed provisionally, and then after 1960, they started to change them to either being permanently listed, meaning that there was safety data to back up the use levels that were, like the use levels and guidelines that were in place for them, or their status was moved to delisted or terminated based on safety results showing that they shouldn't be used anymore. And also at this time, coal tar was being phased out completely from colorants. Because of the use of oil, they were being replaced with petroleum-derived alternatives.
Yeah, that is one thing I always find so funny when brands will give their no-no list and they're like, do not use coal tar in our products. Like, it wasn't even an option.
Girl, we haven't been able to since 1960.
Yeah, no, before my time, but
yeah,
sure, go ahead, speak your truth.
But thank you. I'm glad that they weren't putting this on my dad as a baby.
Like, okay, fine, I won't add it to this moisturizer, I guess. Whatever you want.
Yeah. So the next big color scare happened in 1971 when a Soviet study showed that synthetic colorant red 2 was linked to cancer. This started what was sometimes called the red dye scare.
So that's actually crazy.
Yeah. So we should get into a little bit why red dye specifically. Because obviously, at least to me, it is clear that there is a disproportional hate towards red dyes than any other color.
Yeah.
So why? Well, red dyes are used very extensively throughout the food industry. And the reason for this is because the color red often makes the food look fresher. One example would be like meat. Consumers have this idea that fresh meat should be kind of a red-pink color, but as soon as the animal stops living and the blood stops flowing through it, it loses color pretty quickly. But humans don't really like to know that.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I don't know, like it is interesting, but we've kind of just decided.
Well, we've just kind of been like conditioned to think that. So it's almost.
Yeah. And I'm sure there is some amount of like people used to, you know, slaughter animals on their farm and eat them right away.
Yeah.
And now things do sit on the shelf and they have preservatives in them, but it's like a way to preserve the appearance of it. Because like we mentioned, you don't have to use a high concentration of the dye. You certainly don't have to use 1 to 2% of a synthetic colorant in order to achieve desired results. They also don't really fade very quickly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like almost a preservation thing, but not a real preservation, just a mental preservation.
Yeah.
A lot of foods are enhanced with red food coloring because it just makes them look brighter and kind of more fresh. Even if it's just a tiny amount, adding a little bit of a red food coloring, because red is associated with so many good tasting foods, companies would rather have their products be like slightly orange and stay consistently orange than be like tan and turn kind of brown.
Yeah.
You know?
That makes sense.
So that's why red dye is used more frequently. So it has gotten disproportional amounts of hate because it's just used more commonly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So when this study came out, a bunch of people were really bugged to find out that Red 2 was in all of their food, and they urged the FDA to ban it. And the FDA said that there wasn't enough evidence to show that it wasn't safe, and they kept using it. Later, allegedly, the FDA had already started conducting studies on Red 2, and they were also kind of getting similar results, showing that it was consistent with tumor growth in rats and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So once people found out about that, I mean, it didn't take that long, but by 1976, Red 2 was banned in the US as well.
Were the studies well done?
Well, that's the thing that's kind of hard about this.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific studies. But yeah, it was kind of a situation where they were like looking into it and didn't ban it because they didn't feel like they had sufficient evidence to show that it was harmful.
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't take initiative right away and then ended up banning it several years later. This started a lot of just inherent distrust in the color red.
Mm-hmm.
Because that seemed very shady from an outside perspective.
Interesting.
If Russia banned it and then we said no after a petition and then ended up banning it.
Yeah. The optics of that.
The optics are not great.
Yeah.
After Red 2 was banned, it was pretty largely replaced by the star of today's show, kind of, sort of, Red 40.
Yay.
Okay, so
2 to 40 is my favorite jump.
I know. Yeah. They also banned Red 32 at this time and another orange, I think. But yeah.
You were just banned left and right.
So yeah, the government's delay to ban this red coloring created some really intense distrust in the color red. And the sale of red foods went down super drastically. So much so that in 1976, after Red 2 had been banned, the red M&M was completely removed from manufacture. And for a full decade, there was no red M&M, even though it was never even dyed with Red 2 to begin with.
Yeah, that's so funny to me that they're like, hey, you need to ban this. And then they ban it. And they're like, actually, I'm still not going to eat it. It's like, well, it's banned, so it's not in the food anymore.
Right.
Or it never was to begin with.
This is like almost a perfect example of how these types of like hate trains perpetuate.
Yep.
Is like, is it really M&M's fault? No. People didn't want to eat the red M&Ms because they were scared of red M&Ms.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't using the dye that people were afraid of. And so by just blindly banning it, they almost gave people reason to think that like all red dye was worth banning.
Yep.
So yeah, it's kind of a weird situation where it's like, I get like if your sales are going down as a company, you got to do what you got to do. It doesn't like, no one says like, as M&M, you have to make every color.
Yeah.
You know, they replaced it with tan.
Oh.
It's kind of an orangey tan, but still.
Yeah, it is. That happens all the time now, too, where brands will just respond kind of blindly to consumer pushback.
Right.
And I do wish there was sometimes a little bit more like, no, this is safe and effective. Like,
yeah.
But again, it's so hard because when they're losing money,
of
course, they're more likely to fold to the pressure.
You may have noticed that so far we've been talking solely about food.
Yeah.
While we're on the topic, banning red colorants in cosmetics is always so far going to be like that. Because there are companies that are like, they're trying to remove red colorants from their products with no other information other than people don't want red in foods. And so it's perpetuating this idea that like we need to be banning it in cosmetics as well, even though like it's based on, well, let me tell you what it's based on. We'll get there right now.
Yeah.
So what is up with Red 40? This is where we really start to lose the plot, I think. Americans are so outraged over this color. So much that they banned Red 3 because of ADHD.
You ADHDer.
Yeah.
Getting rid of our red colorants.
I don't know. What is hard here is that I think we were maybe on to something with the tumor thing. Okay?
Yeah.
I think it's very possible, considering the fact that dyes are meant to stick to things and meant to vibrate when they're exposed to energy. I think it's very possible that dyes are not good for you.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about this more, but do we need to eat them? Maybe not.
Yeah.
So as a scientist, I'm thinking maybe at this point we hit a marketing hump to where it's like the people don't care about tumors anymore.
No.
What do we do? I think there's a possibility that colorants are dangerous, but it is also hard, as I was researching this, to figure out how and why exactly we made the jump from tumors to hyperactivity.
Yeah.
And I did my best to uncover that.
It's a bit of a jump.
Yeah.
So.
And the other thing that makes that jump very difficult is that a lot of the foods that contain Red 40 also contain a shit ton of sugar.
Yep.
And other just processed ingredients.
Also, a lot of them also contain other colorants. Like, I'm sure you're
that
gonna hit
part.
on this, but like Fruit Loops, for example, one of the colors is red, and then the rest have other synthetic colorants.
Right.
Aside from the sugar, there's
Yes.
no consistency in people's outrage over all colorants.
Right.
It's just Red 40. Poor Red
Yes.
40. She's a victim here.
Poor Red 40. And even though she's starring today's episode, let's talk about Red 3, because that's the one that just got banned.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear this.
Red 3 is actually one of our original colorants. It's been used in American products since 1906. So yeah, it was back in that list that I read earlier. And a study was done in around 1990 in which rats were fed a diet that consists of 4% Red 3 for 30 months. And some of them had an increase in thyroid tumors.
This is why I asked, was the study well done?
Right. Right.
Yeah, no. If I drank Red 3 for several years
As a rat.
maybe I would have an increased possibility of cancer.
Yeah.
God, these studies are so dumb.
Yeah. Well, they're not going to get any better.
I'm already pissed off.
Somehow, as time continues and history develops, our studies seem to get kind of worse.
Yeah.
So
I think it's because we also, like, this is a whole other conversation, but sometimes there are agendas behind these studies. And like,
yes. And that's, sorry.
no, you go ahead.
That's what makes this one so hard, is because I think we have a lot of agendas working against each other.
Yeah.
Because the food industry makes a lot of money. And the food industry markets primarily to children through very fun, colorful snacks.
Yep.
And the FDA does talk pretty extensively about like fun foods and how certain colorants are allowed in fun foods. And it is kind of a weird thing where I'm like, again, why? I'm not like a health nut by any means.
Same.
But like the example that RFK liked to bring up a lot was Fruit Loops. Other countries still have Fruit Loops, but they don't use the same synthetic colorants that we use. And those types of things I can kind of be like, okay, yeah. Like,
Do they still have the same sugar content though? I don't see how that, I don't know.
yeah, I don't think the dye is necessarily a problem, but I also don't think it's necessary. And where like there are like some tests to show that like, yeah, if we put red dye directly on cancer cells, they get worse.
Yeah.
There's some amount of that. I think where I stand on it is like, I don't know if it's worth the risk of it. You know, like foods don't have to be red,
Yeah.
but I also, red is not, you know, exceptional. Foods don't have to be blue or green or anything. It's just to sell them to children. I'm like, okay, maybe we could just have, like, maybe we could teach our kids to eat canned cereals.
Yeah. Like,
You know,
yeah.
you know,
Cereals
like that's
exist.
kind of where I stand on it, where it's like, if the only reason we're putting these ingredients in there is to make them look more fun, and there's any sort of question that they could be dangerous, then like maybe we could just, there are alternatives, which is the thing, you know?
Yes. The only thing that I would say is coming at this from a capitalistic perspective, I guess, is that if you demonize artificial colors or artificial flavors, which is something that we're not even going to get into, but if you demonize those things and then you say, well, our product has natural colors or natural flavors in it, you can, I'm sure you're going to talk about this, but you can drive up the price of those products.
Right.
Because people are more willing to pay a premium for things that are, quote, healthier.
Yes.
And so by doing studies like the Red 41, where they're, I don't know, injecting rats with 4% or whatever, like that's what I kind of mean by agendas is you can do things like that and then say, well, there's evidence that this is bad for you, so you should do this alternative.
Yes.
You can drive up the price of things and make more money off of that.
Yeah.
I have no evidence that that's what they're doing. I have no idea.
Right.
And I agree with you that like, sure, like we don't necessarily need synthetic dyes in foods, but if the sole purpose of removing synthetic dyes is to replace them with, quote, natural things that are, quote, better for you.
Yes.
And then drive up the price, I don't like that.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let me get through these other tests and then we'll get into discussion mode. Okay, so Red 3. This was the test where the rats were fed a diet consisting of 4% Red 3 for 30 months. This started in utero. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yes.
So really sad.
Yeah, lots of Red 3 for these guys. And there was an increase in thyroid tumors. And after this, Europe banned the use of this colorant with the exception of processed cherries, pet foods, toothpaste, and dyeing eggs. But you couldn't buy the colorant outright as a consumer to use as like a food coloring.
I would love to know how they got that list.
Okay, yeah. I'm feeling like there's something shady happening with cherries. The reason I wanted to talk about that though is because when I just Google, you know, like, should I avoid red food coloring? A lot of the argument like that people make is Europe banned this ingredient 30 years ago, whatever, and we're so behind. Okay. Europe by like 96 had banned it except for, again, processed cherries, pet foods, toothpaste, and dyeing eggs. The US also restricted the use of this colorant in 1990. They banned it completely in cosmetics, topical drugs, and some foods.
This is the Red 3, right?
This is Red 3, yes. So this is where it gets hard again. Because the FDA is a little reluctant. What do you mean some foods?
Yeah, what do you mean? What foods?
Some.
It doesn't say.
No, not really. And that's what people are very upset about now. And I think that's what has kind of further... You can find a list if you like Google it, but the FDA's website didn't say. It just says some foods.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I searched multiple different, I had 7 tabs of FDA's website up.
Yeah.
And I could not find okay, to be fair, also, the FDA does have a database of all colorants that have been used at all. So past, present colorants, all of them, what they were used for, their current status, whether they're still in use, what they can be used for at what concentrations. All of that is technically available, but you'd have to go through like their database to find it.
Yeah.
Just in like their summary of what happened. I feel like that's something that maybe should be a little bit more transparent. But also I think the reason why it's some foods, from what I can tell, is that it is still present in red food coloring.
Okay.
So I think there are foods that still use it, but I couldn't really figure out what the guideline was for where and when it could be used. So that inherently, if I going digging for it, couldn't find it, I think this is just another good example of how the FDA kind of furthered the distrust of red because they banned it completely in cosmetics and medical devices, but still allowed it for use in foods.
But you don't know which foods.
But yeah, they're not...
You have really no way of knowing what food.
Yeah, they're not like super transparent about it.
Yeah.
It just has to be disclosed on the food label. So you kind of have to just check everything you get. So again, yeah, that's something that I wanted to bring up because now that it has been banned, we'll talk about it a little bit more. Everyone's saying like, why did it take America so long to ban this ingredient when Europe banned it all this time ago and blah, 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 blah. And just to give you a little bit more of the full story, America banned it equally as much as Europe did, pretty much, with the exception of maybe food coloring that you can buy and add, like food coloring for baked goods and things.
Those little squeezy bottles you can get. Yeah.
So I think that's where we still kind of have it.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. So when did the conversation turn from cancer research to hyperactivity?
Yeah. Bit of a jump.
And it didn't happen all at once, but it definitely happened at a timeline that I think should be considered.
Interesting.
So the effect of food additives and behavior was initially proposed in 1973 by Dr. Benjamin Feingold. He, based on his own patients, believed that some people were sensitive to foods containing natural salicylates, artificial colorants, and flavors. And he devised a diet called the KP diet or the Kaiser Permanente diet that removed all of these and proposed that that would improve the behavior of children.
Okay.
Later tests show that it didn't really. Like, there's not enough evidence to show that that's the case, but that's when the conversation started.
Okay.
And then it wasn't really until 2004 and 2007 that we started talking about that again. And a study was done that is considered to be groundbreaking, okay?
All right. Did they consider themselves groundbreaking?
Probably.
Yeah, all right.
It was done out of Southampton University, and they gave a bunch of kids, 3-year-olds and then 8 and 9-year-olds. There was I don't know.
Everyone in between that.
Yeah. Like about 150 in each group. They gave them this big old cocktail of artificial ingredients in juice. And the proposal was that if you mix synthetic colorants with sodium benzoate, which is a preservative often used in liquid food preparations,
Like things with water in them.
Yeah, that was what was causing behavioral issues, was synthetic colorants and sodium benzoate mixed together. So they gave all these kids a mixture that had like 4 different synthetic colorants and sodium benzoate and some other different minerals in there. And basically their groundbreaking evidence was that their teachers and parents noticed that there was behavioral differences.
They're teachers and parents that knew the study was being conducted.
But the kids didn't know.
Were the kids?
I don't know if I think maybe the teachers didn't know.
Yeah, I do feel
wacky.
way crazy.
Yeah.
It's like when you tell a kid that like this is alcohol. I've never done this before. But I've heard stories of like if you give a kid water and you're like, this is alcohol, then they start acting like they're all loopy.
Yeah. So there was a lot of there was definitely, as a social experiment, I think something to consider here.
Yeah.
Kids' hyperactivity is obviously changing, but the study is also pretty heavily criticized as inconsistent.
Yeah, I would say that's not well done.
No, because there wasn't like any way to show that it was this drink that was making them behave differently. And again, this was in like 2007. There was also huge things happening at this time, like social media.
Yeah.
Facebook. Yeah. I think it was like 2007, 2008.
But also like you can't base a study off of the perception or opinions of a parent. Like,
there was no like measurable tests really. It was just like their behavior was reported to be worse.
And you added a bunch of dyes. So you can't isolate the effects of any one of them.
Right.
And also it has to be mixed with sodium benzoate.
Yeah. And they were like giving them this drink before school. And it's like, okay, well, maybe it had to do with like the way that they were giving them the drink. Like, did they let them sit in front of the TV and drink it?
Yeah.
There's just too many things.
Yeah. They also probably didn't have a control group, right?
They did. Technically, they had a control group that just drank fruit juice that didn't have any dyes in it.
And there was a measurable difference between the two groups?
That's the thing. It's like, kind of. No, not really. Like, maybe.
And even if there was, like, it wouldn't
there's
really
just
mean
too
anything.
many other factors to really be able to say. it's kind of like if you were to say that making toast in the morning slows you down. So people who eat bread are consistently more late to work. Like that's just not enough evidence to make that conclusion. And this was just kind of one of those situations where it's like maybe the kids that drank the synthetic colorants were worse behaved, but there's just so many other factors here that weren't accounted for.
Yeah.
And just how many people are using this test as like hard and fast evidence when there are so many holes in it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then more recently in 2021, studies out of California positively, in heavy air quotes, confirmed that there is a connection between synthetic food dyes and hyperactivity in children. For how they did this, I really even couldn't find any information. They just did. It's hard, especially in 2021, to just say like, basically the evidence was synthetic colorants are being used more and kids' behavior is worse. And therefore, synthetic colorants are making kids' behavior worse, which, again, we just can't draw that conclusion.
Also, it was directly off the heels of COVID, which is massive for development.
Right.
Whatever.
All of this was just kind of set up for the discussion portion. Unfortunately, that's the full episode. But there are a few little points that I did want to just talk about before we end the episode, because researching for this episode was a little bit interesting. I got a lot of interesting perspective of what other people might find when they go out looking for whether or not food coloring is harmful. So that's kind of what I wanted to discuss before ending the episode. There was a couple videos that I wanted to just kind of recap that I watched, and these were kind of just like the first ones that came up. I searched a variety of different things like, is red dye harmful? Should I avoid synthetic colorants? Stuff like that. And these were top results, at least for me.
Okay.
So the first one was a video from about 8 years ago from Vice TV. It was only a minute long. It's called What Red Dye Does to Your Brains. Okay. And Vice, to be fair, is often kind of satirical. I would hope that people aren't taking this as scientific advice.
Yeah.
But also, there was nothing in the description or anything to say that it wasn't true information from them. Like they weren't saying like, this is parody, don't take, there was no disclaimer like that. They were just presenting it as is. So what I kind of got from this video, it starts by this guy introducing himself. He says, I'm not a scientist, but I've been eating processed foods my entire life because I'm poor. Okay. Those are the qualifications.
Okay.
Mystery Red 40 is in all of our food dyes, and it's really bad. And red is the one that we need to be concerned about because red is used the most. Kind of true, red is used the most. But Red 40 is not necessarily a mystery, like is implied here.
Yeah, we do know about it.
And then, according to scientists, red is the reason that everyone is on Adderall now. That's, again, we kind of talked about it, but we can't jump to that conclusion.
Guys, especially by a guy who is admittedly not a scientist.
Right. So that was if you search is Red 40 bad, this is the first video that comes up.
Oh my God.
At least for me. So that's probably what I'm assuming is the level of information that people are getting first.
Yeah.
The next one was a video that's facts for kids from Hey Guess What? I'm sure it's made by adults, but it's kids in the video. So sorry to these kids, but
they're just products of their environment.
Seriously. But
hyperactive little products.
Yeah. So in this video, they talked about Red 40 and Red 3 are different.
Yeah, can we stop lumping them in together?
Yeah, they're different. They look different. Here are the molecules side by side. Not going to behave the same way. They have different polarities. That's very important for how they interact.
Yeah.
Especially with the human body, which is mostly made of water, a polar substance. So to lump these two things together already, bad science.
Yeah.
But a lot of these videos kind of do that. This video says that Red Dye 3 is so bad that they banned it in January of 2025, but it's still hiding in all of our foods because companies have until January of 2027 to stop using it. That is technically true. They said it's not from fruit, it's not from nature, it's made from chemicals.
Pack it up.
Get out of here!
Sorry. GTFO.
Someone with a teaching degree, get in here. It's not me. I don't have a teaching degree. But as a reminder, fruit and nature, all made of chemicals too.
Yep.
There are still things like arsenic found in fruits.
Yeah.
So that statement there. Then it was banned in makeup in 1990, but was somehow still allowed in our food for decades. We kind of covered that. Sort of, kind of, was it banned in food?
Some foods.
Yes. The next one that I wanted to talk about quickly was a doctor, which makes him sound very credible. Dr. Eric Berg said the dangers of red food dye. He talks about how he thought red velvet cake was a very special treat, but it's not very special because it's just red 40. This is also true. Red velvet's not red flavored. It is red 40 flavored.
I still think it's a special treat.
Sure. But yeah, it's basically just diluted chocolate cake.
Yeah.
It's not a different flavor necessarily. It's just red. And there is a lot of red in it. Starting with that, definitely pulling on your heartstrings a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
He says, the food industry pumps out 15 million pounds of food dye into our food supply.
What?
No other context was given. Just that they pump out 15 million pounds of food dye into our food supply.
Over the course of history, in a month.
Who cares?
Literally.
That doesn't matter.
That doesn't
because
mean
it's
anything.
creating hyperactive kids, allergies, increased risk of cancer, increased estrogen, has the ability to damage your DNA, all of this. He was talking specifically about red 40, and his source was an article called Estrogenic and DNA Damaging Activity of Red Number 3 in Human Breast Cancer Cells.
All right, well.
So, bad science.
Different. So 3 and 40 are not the same number. They're not the same.
Not the same chemical.
Yeah.
They look different. They behave differently.
Yeah.
Bad science.
That's also, it's so frustrating too when they make all of these claims that are really scary sounding.
Yes.
And then there's no actual science behind it. But
yes.
If you're just one-off searching.
Literally, don't tell me that there are 15 million pounds of red dye 40 and then cite an article about estrogen from red 3.
Seriously. 15 million, again, 15 million pounds.
Where? When?
How? How are they pumping it into the food?
How? Yeah, no, I agree. It's just these big egregious claims that just, it's so frustrating because I think there is maybe something here.
Yes.
I think maybe we shouldn't use as much red dye as we do because it is in a lot of foods.
Yeah. But can we use good science to prove
that? Please. Like, that's literally all we're asking is like, the reason that people don't trust us, like us as being scientists, but like the FDA and stuff is because there's so much bad science.
Yes.
Anyway.
Do a double-blind placebo study about the effects of red 40, control the variables, and then maybe we'll listen to you.
Yeah. But I did want to mention, because I have talked about how much red food dye is in foods. There's another video that I watched from Business Insider or Insider Food, why banning red number 3 in America took decades. And they gave a lot of like kind of interesting information. This is where I got the information on red 3 being in food coloring. The one that they looked at was a combination of red 40 and red 3, but red 40 was also present in the yellow and blue dyes as well.
Okay.
So there was red 40 in all 3 colorful dyes. So if you were going to use them, you would be adding, yellow would be actually red 40 and yellow 5. Mm-hmm. It's just because the finished product is more desirable shade of yellow. People like the warm tones that come from red.
Yep.
They had a lot of information in their video that was blown out of proportion and just false. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to take everything that they said as fact, but they did throw in some numbers of percentages of foods that have red dye in them. So they said 25% of all baking decorations, 16% of gums and mints, 13% of candies, and 11% of cookies and biscuits contain red food coloring, which
those are lower numbers than I expected.
I know. Yeah. And I think it's high-ish. And, like when it doesn't have to be in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's also one of those things, like you mentioned, they're kind of low numbers. And for the most part, because of mistakes made in the past, they are being used at very low concentrations.
Yeah.
So you're not eating 4% of your diet in red 40 or red 3.
Yeah.
But yeah.
If you are, we should have a conversation.
Yeah. But for the discussion thing, one thing that we really need to remember, because this is a beauty podcast, is that putting things on your skin is still extremely different from ingesting them.
Yep.
So even if there is data to show that maybe ingesting synthetic colorants could be harmful, the crossover into cosmetics at this stage is not really based in a lot of stuff.
Yeah, like the evidence is shaky at best in ingested studies where they're ingesting it.
Yeah.
That means it is even less legitimate in topical study. Unless, I don't know, unless someone wants to produce a good study about it.
Right. And the one kind of counterpoint to that I think is worth bringing up is when ingredients do prove to be harmful at really high concentrations, it's not necessarily a bad thing for the consumer to be using it in a finished good, but there is a lot more potential for unethical exposure for the workers that are manufacturing that ingredient.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we like to think that that process is a lot more buttoned up and that like safety precautions are being taken. But there are still a lot of workers who are being exploited. Mm-hmm. That is one thing to just consider. Obviously, the dose makes the poison, you know?
Yep.
So more than just outright banning ingredients, I think it's more important to look into sustainability and ethical practices for ingredients.
Yeah.
But just something to consider. Mm-hmm. So just before we end, I don't know. Artificial dyes, maybe they don't need to be in our foods. Maybe they do. I personally think there's enough evidence linking them to cancer that, I don't know, because they're purely aesthetic, there's no nutritional value of the dyes. I think it might not necessarily be worth the risk to incorporate them into foods. But I also want to make it known that that is not me promoting natural, colorful alternatives, because there are very clear downsides to that as well. The whole reason we started using synthetic colorants was because we were unsustainably using the resources that were being used for natural colorants. So I think the actual solution isn't to switch from synthetic to natural, it's to distance ourselves with this attachment to brightly colored foods, which is hard. But yeah, I think it's just another one of those situations where like Red 40 specifically is definitely getting way more hate than it deserves.
Yeah.
After looking into how extensively food dyes are used, I think it would be fair for us to maybe cut back on it a little bit. A lot of these dyes have been being used in food for over 100 years. And we're using them until we have a reason not to. And so far, we're finding reasons not to with some of them. And so I think that's kind of where I'm on the fence with it, where it's like, because there's absolutely no value other than just the way that it looks, I think there's a possibility that with more time and better science, we could find that they actually are harmful.
Yeah.
I don't think that means we need to jump to conclusions and demonize things that are not harmful, but
yeah,
just an interesting one.
No, I agree. I think too, I think it's important for us to remember that even if we did remove artificial dyes completely, that is not going to solve the problem that we have with food in this country.
Right.
Because like I said, you could take artificial dyes out of Fruit Loops. If you're still eating Fruit Loops for breakfast, that's not good for you.
No.
And we have a lot of evidence to show, I mean, diets in the US specifically are horrific.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's because of the synthetic dyes.
No, I think it's because people don't drink water.
Yeah, people don't drink water. The food that we eat is so overly processed and it's so normalized to eat those things on a regular basis. And so if we're going to try to figure out the cause of hyperactivity or, you know, the contributing factor behind these things, I think that it's almost sort of like the macro versus micro impact.
Yes,
where it's like, it's a lot
so.
easier to say that synthetic dyes are causing this than it is to actually look at the system as a whole.
Right.
And understand why these things are happening. Because you mentioned social media. That's a huge contributor to hyperactivity.
Right.
And there's like a very clear increase in hyperactivity and low attention spans in the last like 20 years. But sure, let's demonize food dye so that we don't have to confront that as the problem.
Exactly. Yep. It's a weird one because very much just picking something to be mad at and looking at the history where we have kind of shifted the reason for demonizing it. It's even more so like it feels like we're just trying to put a Band-Aid on something. Like kids are getting more hyper. What could it possibly be?
Yeah.
And there are probably, unfortunately, a lot of this is probably rooted in some classism as well, because red dyes do happen to be in a lot of processed and cheap foods.
Yep.
So,
yeah. But I think if we removed all food dyes tomorrow, like I'm not against removing all food dyes tomorrow. Sure, go ahead. It's not going to solve the problems that you think it will.
No.
And so I think that's sort of like where I stand on it.
I
It's
agree.
like, sure, we can remove them all day. You're still going to have to confront the uncomfortable truth that that is probably not what's contributing to our problems.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm probably still going to eat red Cheetos.
Me too. Life is short.
Yeah.
Live a little.
I like Fruity Pebbles.
Me too. I just had some the other day.
Yeah.
They're really good.
They are really good. I would love to know what colored foods you guys like to eat.
Yeah. And also just in general, what you think about this conversation. Like,
Yeah.
again, the science is very shaky. And so I don't think either of us have a super definitive opinion one way or another.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my opinion is just we need more science. Like we need more evidence for it. But I know there are a lot of people who are very passionate about this topic. So we would love to engage in healthy discussion about it, you know?
Yeah. Definitely one that I think I'm definitely open to better science. But
For sure.
open to discussion too, because I left feeling a lot more conflicted about colorants than I did starting my research. Because I was like, yeah, there are some kind of weird historical patterns here that are...
Yeah.
I don't want to inherently distrust the government.
Yeah. Well... yeah, I don't either, but here we
no
are.
one wants to.
No, I agree. And I think it also opens up a really interesting question because I've had discussions with people before about how cosmetics are regulated. And one of the questions I got was, well, what happens if you don't trust the regulatory body? And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's a valid proposition. And I choose to trust the science. But I mean, we're even at a point now where like, we don't really trust the regulatory body. Like now it's kind of switched. And so like, I think that is a valid part of this conversation.
Yeah.
And it's interesting delving into the history behind it because I think there's validity in that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's common to think that like now is the first time that we should ever have distrusted the government.
Yeah.
But I think there's just a lot more that we don't understand, both in like maybe shady dealings, but also just like there was a lot of instances where I felt like maybe they also kind of had their hands tied, you know, like things were on the market and it would cost a lot of money to completely pull them without a good reason.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It is fascinating, but
it is.
At any rate.
Well, thank you so much. That was a fascinating episode. And I feel like I learned a lot. I'm so glad that we wrapped up this month with good old red.
Comment and let us know what your favorite red snack is.
Yes. What's yours?
Probably not Cheetos, Cheez-Its.
I do love Cheez-Its, yeah.
I really like Cheez-Its.
I also really like a Swedish fish.
Oh, I like a gummy cluster.
Oh, you're a big
I love
gummy
a gummy
girl.
cluster.
Yeah.
And those are red 40'd up. For my social media, I kind of want to post like the colorants that are in a gummy cluster. Probably all of them.
That actually, every single.
Well, they have all the colors on the outside too.
They
so
do.
Probably is like all of them.
You could do the berry versus the original. Yeah.
Yeah, but comment, let us know what your favorite red snacks are.
Yes.
Or other colored snacks.
Yeah. And let us know your thoughts about this episode.
If you liked it and you want to hear more of these types of episodes, let us know.
Yeah, because this was really fun. Maybe we'll do it again.
Maybe.
But in the meantime, you can find us on our website at www.beautyexspeaker.com. And that'll also have all of the sources and show notes. You can email us, info@beautyexspeaker.com.
Yes.
And you can find us on social media at BeautyXspeaker everywhere. And you can find my personal social media. I'm Sadie BXB.
And I'm not BXB.
And we are going to see you guys next week.
We certainly will.
But thank you so much for tuning in. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, I need some red Kool-Aid now. It's hot in here.